I've got something very exciting. This is the Synology DiskStation DS1823xs Plus. And boy, did they put the XS in XS. And the Plus also means you can bring your own devices. There's a lot to unpack. I'm going to show you the basic out-of-the-box perfect setup where you get versioning and control and everything else. I actually wrote a guide for that on the forum. And there's some stuff we need to talk about this setup, because you can go all the way up to 25 gigabit Ethernet. But it's 10 gig right out of the box. Finally. This has 8 2.5 or 3.5 inch bays, 2 USB 3.1 Gen 1 expansion ports, 2 expansion ports, 3 1 gig ports, 1 10 gigabit port. It's got onboard native 10 gigabit, yes, and a 5-year warranty, standard. We here at Level 1 are known for doing things that are a little bit off-label, especially with NAS storage appliances. Things like Synology, things like our past videos. You want to do what with the Synology? Oh, making Synology nervous. Yes, that's what we do. And so this is really not a lot different. The difference is that out of the box, this is actually the fastest NAS processor for like a desktop class NAS that we've seen in an age. It's an upgraded Ryzen 1780B. It's the Ryzen processor that's in here. Ryzen, yes, and also 8 gigabytes of memory right out of the box. No extra upgrade needed. A low-cost upgrade would be the Synology 8 gig stick of memory, so that you add a second one, you get 16 gigabytes of memory. I'm actually going to go 32 gigabytes, but more on that in a moment. Let's unbox and see what we're dealing with. Out of the box, it's an 8-bay NAS. You got to bring your own hard drive and your M.2 and everything else. Synology has their own brand of stuff, which they really want you to use, but you don't have to use that in this model, the XS Plus. That's not always the case. Some Synology models do require Synology drives. It has to do more with qualifications and making everything work. Plus also Synology had some tech support headaches, let's say, from people buying things like shingled magnetic recording hard drives and the incorrect performance class components for their NAS, and so now they kind of warn people because they were kind of caught in the middle. More on that in a minute. We'll talk a little bit more about Synology or not Synology, because they really beefed up the software to complain about not Synology stuff. It's kind of the biggest downside, but not really, but maybe. We'll unpack that in just a minute. But in terms of what you get out of the box, okay, you've got 8 3.5 inch bays, which will also take 2.5 inch hard drives, and you have a pretty good set of bandwidth there. We've got our PCI Express by 8 physical, which is by 4 electrical. That'll be important for some accessories. And then we've also got 2 M.2 slots. Now the M.2 are also limited electrically. I think they're 2 PCI Express 3 lanes, so you're going to be limited to about 2 gigabytes per second for your maximum theoretical speed, but turns out for, a NAS, it doesn't really matter. We've got our built-in Aquantia 10 gigabit Ethernet. That's the sort of middle-ish port at the back. And we also have a dedicated management port on these. You can do out-of-band management. Synology has added that. I think that's a new feature. At least this is the first Synology that I'm looking at that has that feature. And then we have 2 1 gig ports. Now the separate 1 gig ports I've always loved to use with Surveillance Station and using these as a surveillance appliance. Not a lot has changed there. I probably should do a separate video on Surveillance Station and the video aspect of this, because there are some really neat options as far as using these as a security appliance goes. You can use the Chinese knockoff cameras from the internet safely, because they don't have to be on the internet, because you can have the separate, physically separate, isolated, separate 1 gigabit network card, keeping all of that stuff off the internet so that they can't phone home, but the NAS can still see them, and then you can remote into the NAS, and that works really well with Synology software and everything else. And I've also got our E25G21F2 dual 25 gigabit SFP28 NIC. You can do 2.5 gigabytes per second from this thing. Yeah, it's pushing it a little bit. Most people won't get the full benefit of 25 gigabit. There are some edge cases if you fully populate this thing. I'll talk about that. All right, first up, let me show you what we're going for. If you have a NAS like this, I don't care if it's Synology, I don't care if you DIY it, and you have network shares that you're using with your files, you owe it to yourself to set up snapshots and versioning. You can access this in Windows through the Shadow Copy tab on a share, and this should work no matter what you have. Synology, you did your own Linux box, whatever. It should work no matter what. If you're doing it wrong, if you don't have this kind of a setup. What I mean by that is check out this shared folder here. If we right click on it and we go to properties, there's a previous versions tab. And if you look at the previous versions tab, there's one entry in there because I just set up this Synology. And it shows the state of this share at that point in time. There's a bunch of different terminology for referring to these in Windows land. This is shadow copy. While Windows calls these shadow copy, most of the time it's referred to as snapshot, some kind of a snapshot. And usually there's an automated process to automatically prune old snapshots because you can get into very bad territory if you just keep snapshots for an unlimited amount of time. Sometimes keeping snapshots for an unlimited amount of time makes sense. If you have a share that you set up for family photos, for example, yeah, just set up shares that never expire on that, but have it keep, something that's reasonable. So if nothing changes, don't make a snapshot, but if something does change, make a snapshot. And the Synology backup software actually makes that kind of a thing pretty easy to do, because why would you ever change or delete an old family photo? If you make a change or delete an old family photo, then you would always be able to recover it if you kept the snapshots forever. Whereas with documents and things like that, it's like, okay, if you make a change and you decide 2 weeks later you want to roll it back, okay, that makes sense. But if 6 years you decide you want to roll it back, well, that makes less sense for a document share as opposed to family photos. You set all that up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you don't have that feature, you've done something wrong. Now, I've written a guide for setting up that feature. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But that is what you should have minimum setting this up out of the box. So let's get started step by step. Let me take you through it. First off, let's look under the hood. I'm going to show you under the hood because 99% of you don't need to look under the hood. We're going to take the back off. The only time you need to take the top cover off is to install a PCIe card. Period. That's it. We're going to go ahead and install our 25 gigabit card, but we'll test it with both 10 gigabit, the onboard, and our 25 gigabit card. It doesn't take anything away having the card in there, but not doing anything. If you've seen other Synology accessories that use a PCI Express by 8 interface, a lot of the time they'll still work, although the dual M.2 plus 10 gig adapter that Synology had, the M.2 didn't seem to work in this setup, and I guess that's because there's not enough PCIe lanes, but generally it's just a PCIe slot. You can put anything else in there. You may remember from the past videos where it's like, yeah, let's just install an Intel X550 or an Intel 710, and it's like, well, I mean, that's not Synology sanctioned, but it works, I guess. And, that's actually what this is going to upgrade, and then the other one, we're going to set up the Synology replication stuff for offsite backup, because, hey, can never have too many offsite backups, right? That's really all we need to do on the inside. Now, mounting the M.2. You actually can get to the M.2 from the inside. You just take out 3 or 4 of your hard drives here, and you see them in the bays on the side. Now, it doesn't come with any thermal pads or anything like that. You just mount it on the side. I was a little worried about heat, but it turns out that there's enough airflow from your rear fans that you actually get kind of a lot of airflow over the M.2. So the specific Synology M.2s that we had, not really a problem. Have a Samsung 941A. That one runs a little hotter, and it's fine. But there is something you can do. If you use a 4 or 5 millimeter thermal pad between the case and the M.2, then that will work pretty well to wick heat away from your M.2 and into the metal case of your Synology. There's plenty of airflow around that case, so that's just sort of a cheat code hack if you do want to use a non-Synology M.2, which does work, but it warns you. We'll talk more about that in a minute. For the drive configuration, I'm going to use 5 16 terabyte hard drives. We're using 2 Synology brand hard drives and 3 other drives for a total of 5. Look, if you're going to rock this thing with 10 gigabit Ethernet, you're going to want to add a lot of drives. You don't have to. I mean, you could add a minimum of 2 for, a mirror configuration, but 4 or 5 or 6, I think, is the sweet spot if you're going to splash out the cache for this kind of a chassis. It helps if you have 1 or 2 empty bays, and you can also use SATA SSDs for caching. But for my configuration, I'm going to use our M.2s plus our mechanical storage, and we'll cover more of that in a minute. That's just a software thing you can pick. It's like, okay, the M.2 is a separate volume, and it's going to go really fast. Okay, we've got our mechanical storage, and that'll work really well. Okay, you want 4 terabyte SSDs. Well, I tested it with a Samsung Cuvo. We'll talk about that in a second. And all of that basically works as advertised. So getting our drives physically mounted is not really much of an issue. It's the same sort of standard Synology toolless. You just snap it in. You do need to use screws if you're going to use 2.5-inch SATA drives. It comes with those screws. But you won't need those screws for mechanical hard drives, 3.5-inch mechanical hard drives. Now with our 2 M.2 mounted, plus our mechanical hard drives, plus everything else, it's time to boot this thing up. To get it started, you just go to find.synology.com and it walks you through a wizard. The wizard is going to detect all the stuff in here and tell you, okay, this is how we want to set this up, this is how we want to configure this, this is how we want to do this. And it'll give you some options about storage. It gives you the option for RAID 0 and JBOD, just a bunch of disks. You don't want to use either one of those because it doesn't provide any data integrity. If you use RAID 1, that's just a mirror of 2 drives. You could do a 3-way mirror. You have 3 drives and the information is replicated one on another if your data is really, really important. Just because you have real-time replica doesn't mean that you have a backup. You also need a snapshotting solution and ideally a second copy. There's this idea of 3-2-1, a 3-2-1 backup strategy, and if you've never heard that before, you should look into that. We've done videos on that in the past. Check that out. But in the interest of keeping this video not an hour long, let's proceed with the setup. So 5 drives, I'm going to configure this as RAID 6. RAID 6 means that it will tolerate 2 drives dying. For these larger capacity drives, 14, 16, 18 terabytes and larger, it's going to take on the order of about a day to fully image that drive running at full tilt. So if something goes wrong with the drive and you replace a drive that has failed with a fresh blank drive, and let's say that your storage pool is half full, you're going to take on the order of a solid day in order to reinitialize the empty drive using the information on the drives that haven't failed. And it's usually the case that the drive didn't fail for no reason. It's aging, and there is a higher than you would think chance of other drives failing when they're given the relatively stressful task of reading a bunch of information so that the information on the missing drive can be reconstructed onto the new drive. So you tend to see clusters of failures. Well, you don't tend to see, but there is a higher than you would think chance of seeing a clustered failure. So when you've got, kind of a lot of high capacity drives that take a while to image, having 2 drives worth of redundancy plus your offsite backup is definitely a good idea. It's a best practice. So like 6 drives I think is the sweet spot, but I'm doing 5. Once it's initialized the drives and you set up your RAID 6 and all that, you'll want to go into the package center even before we set up network shares and really get things going in terms of your configuration. There's a lot of stuff that you can install that there's no reason not to install. You can use this thing as a cloud server even if you set up the appropriate firewall rules. That's maybe something we could cover in another video, something you want to look at, but you can run your own self-hosted thing that has similar functionality to Microsoft Office for free. It's not quite as featureful as Microsoft Office. It's based on open source software, and the Synology special sauce software lets you sort of manage things and run those things on your actual NAS, which is cool. You can use C2 backup and some of the cloud services we'll talk about in a second, but it actually does run on this as a computer. And I suspect that's part of the reason why, Synology, historically, they really look at the analytics of how people are using their devices. And I suspect that because of the off-label usage that channels like Level 1 Techs have promoted over the past, they're beefing things up. 8 gigabytes of memory out of the box, faster processor, 10 gigabit on board are things we've been asking for years. And it's really nice to see it in an expandable chassis. Good job, Synology. Back in Package Center, the ones that I recommend, exFAT, Active Backup for Business, and each one of these is a world unto themselves. The surveillance station, if you're going to use the camera surveillance station, there is separate software licensing components for that. Virtual Machine Manager, again, there are some separate licensing components. There's pretty good basic out-of-the-box functionality, but there's, let's call it freemium. There's some premium upgrades you can do. There's several packages like that. You maybe want to do Office 365 backup. Microsoft Office 365 doesn't really provide backup services as part of your Office 365 subscription. It's a little bit of a nuance there. They do actually provide backups, but if Bob or somebody accidentally deletes one whole branch in your SharePoint installation, Microsoft really just does disaster recovery, and it takes them a long time to do the recovery. There should be stuff in SharePoint that will let you undelete, like the recycle bin thing, for example. But if there's not, then your only option is to just restore your entire tenant, which is not fun. It's sort of a thing that can happen, like it's useful. It's a useful backup in like a ransomware situation. It's not a useful situation in an idiot executive situation. So bear that in mind for backup. Whereas Office 365 Active Backup for Business here, you can drill down to individual items. It's a freebie. It's pretty nice. It's worth looking into separately. The beta version of the SMB service finally adds native SMB multi-channel support right out of the box, and they have an article about it. I'm glad to see that. That's amazing. And the key package that started me on this meander was a replication, snapshot replication. It sounds like it could replicate snapshots to another Synology, and it can, but it also provides a convenient GUI for us to set up that whole shadow copy thing I started harping on like 20 minutes ago. Now let's talk performance. Can you get 2.5 gigabytes per second out of this? Well, I had to juggle my disks a little bit, it turns out. If you're running 5 mechanical hard drives, each one of them at its theoretical maximum of 200 megabytes per second transfer, you're just barely going to be past that 1 gigabyte per second, roughly, throughput that you get from a 10 gigabit interface. Not bad. I mean, being able to pull a gigabyte per second from mechanical hard drives with no SSD caching or anything else, pretty doggone impressive. Writes are a little slower. So if you're writing to the NAS, you're not going to see quite 1 gigabyte per second in that scenario. For the M.2, because the M.2 are also PCIe lane limited, it is harder to get that 2.5 gigabyte per second bottleneck from your 25 gigabit Ethernet card. So I think that's why I recommend that if you're going to go with the 25 gig interface, really understand what your limitations are and understand that under the hood the hardware is going to be running full tilt in order to meet that 2.5 gigabyte per second, which means that you need a fully populated chassis, in other words, I think, to get the most advantage out of that. Now for 10 gigabit, it's been the case for ages, which is why we were asking for it, that 1 gigabit and even 2.5 gigabit is kind of limited. I mean, 2.5 gigabit, we're only talking about 250 megabytes per second. You can do that with a single drive. So, of course, you're going to bump up against that limit. Now, with onboard 10 gig, your limit is a gigabyte per second. And pretty much any reasonable hardware configuration for this, not just the top-end configurations, but, just 3 drives with a single drive of redundancy, you're going to be using way more than 250 gigabytes per second of your 10 gigabit interface, but you're probably also still not going to see that full 1 gigabyte per second overhead. With the fast 4-core CPU, because the clock speed is so high, that's also a really big benefit here. So the whole package really does come together pretty nicely. For the dual M.2 setup, I did sort of edge on the side of insanity and tried with a RAID 0 setup. The absolute maximum internal bandwidth that you can get from this thing, even before you get to the network interface side of things, is about 3.2 gigabytes per second. So you can saturate a single one of these 25 gigabit Ethernet interfaces. There are 2, but it's really meant for a primary backup type situation, not a link aggregation type situation. It's not even really going to help you in terms of latency. So think of it as a single 25 gig interface instead of a dual 25 gig interface with redundancy. That's probably the best way that you're going to use this. Real world with SSD caching, I think that you're going to probably be more in the 1.5 gigabyte per second range in normal scenarios. Synology's also tweaked their software a little bit in the past. They let you do a kind of hybrid RAID with SSDs and mechanical hard drives. That seems not to work the way that I remember it anymore. And I think that's probably a good thing because nobody else is doing that. And there was probably weird geometry problems where your performance would be wildly inconsistent mixing SSDs and mechanical hard drives in non-cache roles. For that, you've probably experimented with that if you're watching this long and with open source packages and other stuff. And it's really hard to get that right. So it's probably a good thing that it's like that. Now let's talk scary warnings. So this Synology NAS does give you a lot of warnings when you're not using Synology stuff. It just says, hey, this is unqualified, we haven't tested this, don't know what's going on with this. And the reason they're doing that is because, 1, the product has taken off in popularity, and 2, they tell me they get a lot of support calls from people that have had random hardware added to this, which is causing problems. Things like shingled magnetic recording, things like the cheapest, crappiest M.2s you can possibly get. Think unscrupulous installer. Somebody says, oh, I want to run a surveillance system, and they're going to get like the cheapest eBay surveillance cameras they can possibly get, plus the Synology because they got the software, plus some storage and other stuff, and then they hand it off. And so in that scenario, they say it's not really good if somebody is getting subpar disks and subpar M.2 because they're going to wear out prematurely in like a year. It doesn't matter that Synology offers a 5-year warranty, which is what's on this chassis, very good. The person is not going to have a good experience with Synology. It says Synology on the box. They don't understand. Okay, I kind of get that. But there are scripts that will let you unlock the functionality on the Synology to just make it not complain about other disks. So if you have an unscrupulous person who's going to put not Synology stuff in it, then the unscrupulous person is probably also going to run a script to make it not complain about its own disks. In fact, when I first installed our Synology MVS 400 gigabyte M.2, which, again, Synology has lowered the capacity of those drives. They are what's called under-provisioned. The provisioning on the drive is much lower than the true NAND capacity, so that you've got a lot more room for cells that wear out. What that means is that our 400 gig M.2 shows in the GUI is like 376 gigabytes, because it's the difference between powers of 2 and powers of 10. But truly, that is a 512 gigabyte capacity NAND device. But they reserve so much of the capacity for wear. Because if you use it as a cache and you're using it as a write cache, when you fill up these 16 terabyte hard drives, that little 500 gigabyte M.2 is going to have 16 terabytes of information potentially cycled through it. It's going to be a pretty significant amount of wear on the M.2. Now, did it work with our Samsung M.2? Yes it did, but you get a warning. And it is really, when you first log into Synology, you get a storage pool warning at the bottom, and it's orange, like a drive has died or something is wrong. I would maybe prefer there was something in the GUI to say this is, not a fully Synology certified thing if we're going to go for the, we want to try to minimize the support thing. And Synology, of course, is going to charge extra or going to charge a premium on top of their cost. And it's up to you to decide, what you think is fair. If you have a mechanical hard drive and the premium for the Synology qualified version of the same mechanical hard drive is 10%, 20%, okay, that makes sense. If in your market the premium is 100%, it's a little tougher. It's a little tougher to swallow. But it does mean you're going to have to do your homework and pick a drive, and also have to be upfront with a customer if a customer is paying you to do this, to say, hey, I didn't use Synology drives in here. It's going to warn you about that, but here's how I did my homework, just so you know. And if you call Synology support, they're going to say, well, this is some random hard drive. It's not a Synology hard drive. Sorry. One place this can be really important is with the memory. Synology has error-correcting sticks of memory, and I have 32 gigabytes of error-correcting Synology memory in this chassis, which is great. Having all that RAM for cache and everything else is really awesome. Containers, virtual machines, the whole 9 yards, it's great. But if you use different error-correcting memory, it doesn't necessarily work exactly perfectly correctly, and you don't really have a BIOS or console port on here in order to do that. Okay, there is actually a console port on the bottom, which is really just cool AF, but it's meant for like power users. It's not meant for somebody to plug in a VGA monitor and say, hey, does this work? Because it's actually some kind of serial protocol, but I digress. Now, you could say that Synology is just after money, because they take a Toshiba hard drive, modify it, not a super amount, and then say, oh, look, it's a Synology hard drive. Okay, that's fine. I actually added my own Toshiba N300s in here just to be able to do the performance comparison to see if there's a difference. There's not. I also thought maybe they would do something like disable trim on non-Synology SSDs. That's not the case either. Trim seems to work fine. You set it up as a scheduled task, and FS trim and everything else like that works from the command line. There is a script available that will add third-party hard drives to the trusted list to make the scary warnings go away. But, I mean, again, it's just, are you going to do that? Will that survive a DSM upgrade? Probably not. So when you go to upgrade the DSM, it'll do that. So maybe the unscrupulous person that runs the script, when their customer goes to upgrade DSM or DSM auto upgrades, then they get the warning. It's like, what did you do? It's like, I got screwed. I don't know. I don't know. This is large business problems, not hobbyist home user power user problems. But for the XS Plus with 8 bays, not really a problem for the home lab power user. You can use whatever you want, bottom line. So my best case scenario was, I'm gonna make it angry. I installed 4 terabyte Samsung QVO hard drives. So these will do 500 megabytes per second all day long. All 8 bays, 32 terabytes of flash storage into it. Yeah, it's not. You can use it for that use case, and it is absurdly fast. Yeah, it's not happy. It's absurdly fast. It's absurdly fast in that scenario. Let me see if I can silence it. It's pretty cool. It gives us a GUI option that's like, something catastrophic has happened. And then I say, okay, it's fine. And then it says, okay, it's fine. It's a pretty good feature, because if you have a drive die and you don't set it up to email you, which you should totally do, you can. And it works well. But notice that those are not on the list. They're not Synology. They're just Samsung, and they work fine. But it also sort of helped me figure out that the internal bandwidth limit you're going to get is about 3 gigabytes per second, give or take, which is the total aggregate you get from about 6 disks. We have 8 physical disks, so really, don't go nuts with all SSDs for this. If you're going to go 8 SSDs and you want the absolute maximum performance, you're going to have to probably trade up and get a more expensive chassis. Sorry. But for a mechanical drive chassis with optional SSD storage, that is a spectacular result. The fact that we're saturating 10 gigabit Ethernet without a lot of effort is great. It's fabulous. I love it. Synology has done a good job putting this hardware together, and I appreciate it. Now, in terms of the Synology Cloud and upselling you features and all that stuff, there is a lot in here that Synology tries to upsell, and they're going to make a lot of money on it. C2 backup is actually cheaper than Amazon services, although you can deploy Amazon services. That package center, if you get one of these, it would behoove you to look through the package center at all the cool stuff you can install, because there's a lot there. C2, you have to understand, it gives you not just offsite backup capability, so you can enroll and give Synology a few bucks, and then this thing will start using your internet upload to back up to the cloud, and you can pick up another one of these and restore it, and it's fine. Or if there's an incident, Synology can just mail you a new one, and if you got Synology disks and everything else, you just move your disks over, or if there's some other problem, you can restore from the cloud, is what I'm trying to say, which is awesome. And you get snapshots and backups in the same sort of familiar GUI that you have. So that is a nice feature. There are people that are looking for that in a turnkey kind of a solution. And actually, open source and other, even free software solutions could take a page out of the book here, because I guarantee you that if your favorite free and open source and freemium, software NAS packages offered a turnkey solution where here's our cloud backup, and we're going to charge you, a few bucks over what it costs us to give you cloud storage, but you just put in your username and password in our free software, and you get a cloud backup that works reliably and works well. They would make money from that. That's a pretty easy thing for them to do. They just don't want the liability of having to babysit somebody else's data. Synology is a big company. They're kind of the big company for this kind of thing, and they've outlasted their competitors that were larger, which is really interesting because performance and reliability, and it's a whole other conversation, but they're willing to take those kind of risks and put this together. I mean, heck, you can get a Synology SAN, not a NAS, which is even more enterprise, even more people get so happy if it doesn't work correctly type of hardware. But I've reviewed one of them. It's pretty decent, good for backups, snapshots, smaller clusters, that kind of thing. You can do iSCSI on this, so for the home lab use case, if you want to do like an iSCSI boot off of the NUCs, the Intel NUCs that I was reviewing previously, you can do that from here. Maybe that's another thing we can look at. In addition to the C2 thing, something you also get for free for signing up, it kind of harasses you about that I glossed over when we were first doing the setup, the initial drive setup, was setting up a Synology account. If you set up a Synology account, you can actually log into the Synology web portal. This thing will punch a hole through your firewall or your carrier grade NAT or whatever, and then your software that you're running on here will be available on the internet through a secure login, which is sort of nice. You can even do two-factor login, so they set all that up for you. You can even do SMS and push notifications right from the Synology GUI. Again, these are things that Apple and Google have made sure that you have to have some sort of cloud infrastructure. It's hard to roll push notifications entirely on your own from a self-hosted solution, whereas with this, it's push button. So again, the cost differential is the value add that Synology has, and a lot of people sort of go that route. Of course, if you want to DIY it, more power to you. You're definitely on the right channel for that. But I like using these as a base and a building block for this kind of thing sometimes. When my grandma wanted cameras to set up at her place, this is what we went to Micro Center to buy, because it was like you just plug it in, you plug in a camera, done. How hard is that? So, overall, the verdict, the DS1823xs Plus. Bear in mind that it's a little aggressive about wanting Synology stuff. Overall, it's the most negative thing that I can say about it. It is well built. The cooling fans are ample, even when I've got a fully populated configuration. The M.2 and the software are really polished as well. I like the DSM upgrades. This is DSM 7, I think update 5. And so it adds a lot of features, a lot of flexibility. I really like Surveillance Station. I really like being able to run Virtual Machine. I really like being able to run Docker. You want to run Docker and Home Assistant with some high availability backed up to the cloud. If you wanted to use this as your central brain for your home automation hub with a Zigbee interface and an interface to your home alarm and everything that we've done in the home automation series, this will do it. I've even used the USB ports to pass through USB Z-Wave controllers, and it works fine, which is impressive that you can go that far off script with Synology GUI without even having to log into the command line, which by the way is Linux. SMB multi-channel, something we always champion at level 1. In Package Center, if you install the beta version of SMB3, which means that it's going to be default, and set the SMB3 option in the GUI, you get SMB multi-channel out of the box, which really helps boost your performance. You can clear a gigabyte per second with this thing almost with the out-of-the-box configuration using the beta version of the SMB with pretty much any 10 gigabit client. Very, very impressive. So overall, it's pricey, but you get what you pay for. I'm Wendell, this is Level 1. I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forum.